Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of every heart be acceptable with thee, our rock, our redeemer. Amen. One theologian says that Psalm 139 is a prayer that does not ask for anything. The psalmist makes only one request at the very end. Search me and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. But this psalm is mostly and largely a testimony about God's closeness and knowledge of the human creation. Whoever the writer of this psalm is, she taps into an experience of God that emphasizes God's inseparable, inescapable connection to her. Whoever the writer is, the prayer celebrates being known, that above all else and despite all that may come against her, God is intimately aware of and present with her, as close to her as her very breath, and knows her through and through. This is a testimony to a relationship and connection to God, eternal and infinite. But this is also one of those chapters in the Psalms in which we rarely read the second half. Oh, that's what those lectionary people do. They give you only snippets to fill out the theme. But if we read on, we find out that this is not just a spontaneous hymn of praise, nor a generic piece of liturgy to fill out the worship. When we read further, we discover why the psalmist talks about God's knowledge, presence, and power with them personally. You see, the poetic language of the text we read today, with its praises of God's direct involvement in the psalmist's life and existence, and its testimony of being known and loved by God, is the prayer of someone who has known great suffering at the hands of what they describe as the wicked and bloodthirsty and malicious. This is someone who has been oppressed, rejected, falsely accused, and needs God to take a stand and judge those who do not do justice. This psalmist goes beyond simply the words of comfort to testify to being known and loved by God, to reinforce their own humanity in light of oppression and injustice. So when Psalm 139 is read in its entirety, we see a bigger truth. These are more than just words of praise for God's knowledge, presence, and power, though they be praised. I submit to you that this is also a protest. That even in the world that refuses to acknowledge it, that one's very humanity bears the mark of God and thus has worth and dignity. So when this suffering psalmist sings, "You have searched me and known me. I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and my frame was not hidden," we are invited to see the presence of God within them. We are invited to see the presence of God in our neighbor, to celebrate each other as the living manifestation of God. Oh, in this season of Epiphany, God's appearing may not come in the miracle or the grand display of power or in the natural wonders of the earth, but in each of us, in our neighbor, in the most vulnerable, in the suffering souls whose humanity has been denied and whose personhood assaulted. It is a testament that none of us is hidden from God. Rather, we are inextricably connected to God and each other. In another chapter of the Psalms, the psalmist asks, "Who are we that God is mindful of us?" Psalm 139 is the reply. We are God's beloved, knitted and formed by the very hand of God, known and fearfully and wonderfully made, the wonderful work of God who is present in each of us. Oh, I can hear the psalmist singing the song in a new key in our own time, echoing the claims of humanity in the cries that Black Lives Matter, in the echoes of the cries of no justice, no peace, gay is good, women's rights are human rights, me too, no one is illegal, trans lives matter, and yes, I have a dream. It is a psalm that beckons us to sing with the harmony of liberty for every member of the human family. So, as we prepare to observe Martin Luther King Day on Monday, how do we sing and pray the truth of God's knowledge, power, and presence at a time when humanity is regularly denied and personhood routinely assaulted? What in our words to the world testifies to the divinity that resides in our neighbor when injustice abound? Oh, it warms my soul. It warms my soul that we observe the King holiday during the season of Epiphany, for I believe it is through the words, work, and legacy of Martin Luther King that God may be revealing something, some wisdom, some prompting that can inspire our pursuit of justice. Oh, this is also a time when people will take to social media and post their favorite King quotes. I confess, it is the saturation of social media with King quotes that raises some concern for me. Oh, now, I do not begrudge anybody's appeal to the wisdom of Dr. King, especially during the King holiday. However, I worry that too many of us do so without understanding how truly radical, prophetic, and uncompromising Dr. King's words are. And so just as we need to read all of Psalm 139 to understand the true power of the prayer, I hope we read beyond the posted King quote to know the true power of his witness. Behind every speech and every sermon King gave is the lived experience of Black lives that were degraded, segregated, victimized, and yes, even killed. And so unless we are willing to know the suffering that gave rise to the words, we run the risk of robbing King's prophetic oracles of their true power and dulling their light of truth and revelation that's straining to be unveiled in our own time. So to and for suffering Black people, King's words were a testimony to a truth that eluded America for far too long, that Black people are loved and known by God. This nation justified enslavement, segregation, oppression of Black lives by claiming that somehow God ordained it. In protest and praise, Dr. King gave voice to Black worth and dignity, that Black people were fearfully and wonderfully made, and despite law, culture, and religion, bore the imprint of the eternal and infinite God. Oh, he said it with such justice brio. Black lives are infused with some bodiness. And with his familiar words about choosing love over hate, pursuing justice, the power of nonviolence, and being a true neighbor who lifts the bruised and beaten to a higher and more noble life, King joins the psalmist in bearing witness that every person is the wonderful work of God. Perhaps that's what the psalmist offers us during this season. An awareness of the somebodiness of humanity. An invitation to recognize God's knowledge, power, and presence in each of our neighbors. It is a hymn that sings about Black lives mattering, LGBTQ lives being celebrated, and immigrant and refugee lives being welcomed. It is a reminder that although we are menaced by death, oppressed by injustice, dominated by the powerful, our humanity and our personhood are intricately woven into God's very act of creation from the beginning of time. Oh, if we would only know and see ourselves as part of that wonderful work of God. In the aftermath of the violent insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, I was listening to a radio show focused on the event when a distraught listener called in. With sadness and frustration, the caller kept asking the radio host, "What can we do to get along? How can people stop seeing their neighbors as enemies to be vanquished or even killed?" I don't recall the radio host's answer because the answer I kept hearing echoes the psalmist's own prayer. See our neighbors as known and see our neighbors as fearfully and wonderfully made by God. See our neighbors as the manifestation of God's presence. Let your neighbor be the epiphany of the day. For it is in seeing God in our neighbors, seeing our neighbors as fearfully and wonderfully made, that we can begin to overcome the scourge of white supremacy, of anti-Semitism, sexism and misogyny, homophobia and transphobia, and anything that might cause us to lift a hand against another. In God's inescapable presence, each one of us is a unique, particular individual life known and loved by God, and yet connected. The empire, our culture, and our religious institutions may see us as citizens, voters, races, patients, clients, consumers, ethnicities, believers, congregants, non-believers, respondents. But the psalmist goes beneath the surface of all these socially constructed identities to get at the heart of who we truly are, God's own beloved creation. Oh, it is wonderful to be seen and to be known truly and deeply. That was Dr. King's quest, that all would be known. That is God's gift to us, the gift of being known. And oh, it is too wonderful. Amen.